Ani, I was sitting in the back. It's a lot darker back there. Ani, Bojo, and thank you. Thank you for the invitation and congratulations on hosting such a successful event. I would like to begin by acknowledging something that's important for us, usually as First Nations people when we come and speak, to acknowledge that as today, right now, we are sitting on the territory of the Algonquin Nation. I'd like to acknowledge them and thank him for letting us gather on the land. And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak. As you've heard, my day job is as Executive Director of the National Association of Friendship Centers. And we have now 120, if it's grown, friendship centers on the front lines of serving urban Aboriginal people every day all across this country. And I could use my time here today to speak about the great work that they're doing, the impacts that we're having, but I think we all know we have a higher calling today. And my task is to reflect upon the upcoming 150th birthday of Canada and its impacts on Aboriginal people. Now, this is a tough note for me to write because I have to be honest, it's not intuitive that I would celebrate this or we as nations would celebrate this. And I think maybe it might be helpful to consider our shared history together and why we have these conflicts in my mind. Prior to Canada's birth, we went through 4 stages between Canada and the original nations that were here. The first was contact. The second was a period of peace and friendship as that contact extended across. And I think this is best exemplified by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which recognized that the original nations of this land could only sign treaties and have their land taken by signing with another nation, not by individuals. And I think in many ways, that is the ideal which we are still trying to get back to today, but more on that later. I think this original relationship quickly changed to an economic relationship. We know about the fur trade, you wanted our trees, hoping for gold somewhere as you kept going across, opening up new trading routes, and slowly dependency began to emerge. We quickly moved to a period of military alliances, as equal nations fighting for this country on one side or another in these battles. I think the War of 1812 is probably the most visible and vocal version of this, but there's many examples of this across our collective history. And then along comes Canada. The birth of the Métis and the rebellions, along with Sitting Bull and some of the activities that were happening in the West, marked a clear change in the relationship between what was now Canada and the rest of the original nations. After Confederation came a view that First Nations, now Métis and Inuit, were now subject nations, no longer partners, and quickly became subject peoples. The Indian Act was the first major step in this direction. They defined who an Indian was. They defined who belonged to a nation. They defined who could live in their own communities. And then the nature of the treaties that were being signed across the country were another step in this direction of a subject people and subject nations. While many treaties recognized that there was a nation-to-nation relationship, but as this expansion moved west, all of a sudden treaties no longer needed to be signed. In many major areas of this country, BC and others, there was not even an attempt to sign treaties because it felt it wasn't necessary. The next period is probably the darkest and of Canada's history and has some tremendous impacts all the way till today. That of direct assimilation. Kill the Indian and the child, as Duncan Campbell Scott once said. Residential schools. Ban our cultural ceremonies. Starvation. Cultural genocide. Stolen land, broken treaties, the 60 Scoop are all examples of this direct assimilation Canada had against the original peoples of this land. Slowly, direct assimilation turned to more of a passive attempt. Indians were extended the votes in the 1960s. I mean, my father couldn't vote when he was a young man. When he was 18, he was an Indian, he wasn't allowed to vote. I mean, these changes have come in such a short amount of time. The white paper was proposed by then Minister of Indian Affairs, Jean Chrétien, and a new political consciousness emerged amongst the first peoples of this country. Then somehow, a period emerged, almost as if by accident. Passive support. Inclusion in the Constitution. The Charlottetown Accord. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Now, I'm not suggesting that these victories came without battles. The inclusion of Aboriginal title and rights in the Constitution came after hard-fought battles. Charlottetown Accord and the provisions in there came only because of the exclusion of Meech Lake. And the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, well, it came because of all these issues, but also became because of Oka and a bunch of Mohawks standing up for, well, what was a golf course ultimately, but standing up for their own land. But these changes came just the same. And it makes me reflect upon where we are today. And something has changed again. If you consider the Kelowna Accord, which ultimately never was fully implemented in this country, but it was a programmatic response to the impacts of grinding poverty which still exists in our communities, and was accepted by 14 Canadian jurisdictions, representative First Nation governments, Métis governments, and Inuit peoples. It is truly astounding that an agreement could be made. This is not something we could have envisioned happening even 20 years ago. The residential school apology. Canada's recent commitment to endorse the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are all examples of a change of attitude which seems to be taking place. And we've referenced the Olympics. What about the incredible inclusion of the 4 host nations as official heads of state during the Olympic Games? Other than the fact that they use an Inukshuk as their symbol for a BC Games, it was an incredible acknowledgement. But what comes now? And what comes next? As I reflect back on what we built together over the past 143 years, it makes me wonder, how do we turn the page and continue to move forward? I propose that in 7 years, at Canada's 150th birthday, that the Queen issues a new royal proclamation. And that proclamation would formally recognize that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples constitute a first order of governments in this country. That we put in place the kind of supportive services and governmental supports that would repair the damage done from the previous 150 years of colonization. And I would say that we already have that roadmap. It was provided in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996. I think it's time to breathe new life into the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and their recommendations. And I ask you now, what could be a more fitting celebration of Canada's 150th birthday than to reconstitute the original nations who have been so badly damaged? Our legacy together can be the end of so many peoples and original cultures, or it can be the beginning of new collaborative relationships. If we don't do it now, when will it be done? We need to build upon the momentum of these past few years and fully address the hurts and impacts of these years of colonialism. In many aspects, Canada will not be a complete nation until we do so. So let's take these first few steps together. Miigwech, thank you.